Okay, so we're going to get started on how it is that we think about utilitarianism. First, by looking it up in this glossary from a textbook I have. So, utilitarianism is a normative theory that we ought to concern ourselves with the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Okay, so it's a normative theory, so that it's normative is how we're distinguishing it from that which is descriptive. So, in other words, this is the way we ought to act so as to gear our actions toward consequences that bring about the happiness for the greatest number of people. The happiness or the pleasure for the most amount of people. And so that's where we get a base definition of what utilitarianism is by way of an ethical theory that gets off the ground by way of Jeremy Bentham, who was born in the 18th century. So he was born in 1748 and died in 1832. J.S. Mill is about solidly in the 19th century, so he's 1806 to 1873. And so these two thinkers are the developers of what we know utilitarianism to be today, okay? And so utilitarianism is an empirical ethical theory, and so it is also working similarly to the way that we understand what David Hume was pointing out in his work on morality. And so that is then giving us more of a definition of utilitarianism to indicate that if we are favoring the consequences, if we value the consequences that bring about the greatest happiness for the most amount of people, the happiness there that is quantified by the greatest number of people is something that can be empirically understood, okay? And so, in other words, emotion is something that can be empirically traced. And so that empirical way in which emotion can be quantified is a way of judging the value of the morality for the most amount of people, or a majority of people that were affected by particular actions, consequences, okay? So again, the moral value rests on the consequences, and this is in contrast to natural law, because natural law is non-consequential, and as we saw earlier, this is also a way of distinguishing the is-ought problem as well. And I'm not going to get into that other than to say that there is a difference between a descriptive way that we understand things versus a normative way that we understand things, and that the empiricists, because they are resting their because they rest the moral value on the consequences that an emotion brings about, and that could be empirically traced, then the indication is that there's not anything that is innate in man and likewise innate in nature that can be said to be a directive as far as our moral behavior, okay? So that gives us a sense how it's consequentialist, to be distinguished from natural law, likewise how it's empirical, okay? And so that empirical basis is something that is important in terms of its normative value in terms of quantity, but we also know that J.S. Mill was famous for drawing the distinction between quantity and quality. So it's often said that Jeremy Bentham often favored the quantity of happiness, whereas J.S. Mill favors the quality of happiness. And so with the quality of happiness, we see that that is distinguished for J.S. Mill as something that looks a lot like Epicureanism. So remember that with Epicureanism had that hierarchy of pleasure, and that hierarchy of pleasure is something that J.S. Mill is keen into as valuable for the quality of pleasure, okay? And so that quality of pleasure is a hierarchy of pleasures, okay? That's a way of distinguishing J.S. Mill's particular stamp on utilitarianism to be distinguished from his influence, Jeremy Bentham, okay? And so if we start thinking of a problem with utilitarianism, one criticism that's often made of utilitarianism is brought about by this idea that when we have when the consequences are favoring the happiness for the most amount of people, the problem with that is that when we're considering the most amount of people and the value resting on the consequences, the resulting problem is that there are a minority of people who are left out of that happiness, who are not accounted for, and who therefore do not seem as valuable. Okay, their happiness or their pain, if you will, is not taken into account with regard to the utilitarian standard, whereby we base the value of morality on consequences. Okay, and so this is a way of thinking that has us seeing that the problem of quantity there in terms of the amounts of people. So, in other words, the majority of people becoming happy does not always account for the minority of people who are suffering. Okay, so that's a basic critique of utilitarianism, and that's usually brought in with the so-called trolley problem, whereby if you had it in your control to divert a train, whereby the train would inevitably kill one person versus if it went on one track, and it would inevitably kill 4 people if it went on another track. If you had control as a utilitarian, the suggestion is that you would divert the train so that it went to kill the one person, because you would be favoring the happiness for the most amount of people. And so we could see there that the minority then is not accounted for as for a utilitarian in a way that becomes problematic. Okay, and so if we start thinking of environmental issues, one way that I like to think about a problem with utilitarianism is, for instance, when we start thinking of recycling, so recycling plastic bottles and waste, consumer waste, etc. How is it that we're able to gauge the happiness for the most amount of people by way of the initial action we take to start recycling? So, in other words, how is it that we are bringing about happiness by way of recycling? Or are we, so in other words, is happiness the end result? So is happiness for the most amount of people the end result of the recycling that we begin to do as an aiming all the same to bring about happiness? Question, right? And so there's that. And then also, how is it that we could start thinking of utilitarianism as an ethical theory that is viable? We see that the way that we often work in our ethical evaluations is rather utilitarian. So in other words, whenever we're trying to get the best results out of a situation, out of a consequence, we usually will go to taking a tally to see how it is that people are satisfied or made happy by a particular action, okay? And that's how the value of the situation is gauged. So the easiest example is, like, for example, with this class, the way students are asked to evaluate the class at the end of the semester, and oftentimes that's the way that school officials can gauge whether or not this class is any good to begin with. And so we could see that there's a way in which you're quantifying satisfaction and or happiness, okay? So I think that gets us pretty good without too much noise, and then likewise environmental disturbances, because I have to fight that a lot when I'm doing these videos. So it's surprising how much I have to contend with the elements and in the environmental noise. But I think that gets us good to get us started with utilitarianism and thinking about how it's a moral theory as empirically based, consequentialist, etc. Okay, so thanks, class.